Ele inspirou uma geração de economistas latino-americanos, foi um dos pioneiros do chamado desenvolvimentismo, fundou várias instituições, como a CEPAL, Banco Central da Argentina, a UNCTAD, entre outras. Raúl Prebisch foi amado, temido e odiado. Agora ganha uma biografia elogiada pela revista Economist e lançada no Brasil pela Fundação Celso Furtado. O autor, Edgard Dosman, está aqui para conversar com a gente. Professor Edgard, I have to begin with a challenge. You wrote a 600 pages biography on Raúl Prebisch. I ask you, please, to introduce Prebisch in a few phrases, please.
Raúl Prebisch was one of the great economists of the 20th century. He was Argentine, born in 1901, died in 1986, but he is the father of development studies, and as you said, he was a creator of institutions and a Latin American of fundamental importance. Plus, he's come back. He's now more important than ever.
Why?
Raúl Prebisch believed that there was a break in the system between countries that produced commodities only and those that were industrial countries, and that the commodity-producing countries were at a disadvantage. And they were at a disadvantage because sooner or later those commodities would dry up, the market wouldn't be there, but above all because commodities didn't produce value added. Whereas the export of industrial goods had the great advantage of improving technology, education, and therefore helping to produce permanent growth and employment.
This problem was one central concern of Prebisch's thought, how to deal with this economy commodity exporter. I think nowadays we are running through something in the same way. Brazil is a commodity exporter with one destiny, like China. In that times was England to Argentina. And are we running this kind of risk that Prebisch was kind of concerned?
Well, first the academic in me says that it's 25 years since he died, and therefore a lot of things in the world have changed. But there's no question that Prebisch would have been very concerned by the way in which, in Brazil, exports of manufactured goods have fallen, and the exports of commodities have grown. No doubt about that. He felt that this led to overvalued currencies, and therefore deindustrialization. So to that extent, he would have been concerned. But bear in mind that we went through this in the 1970s. The 1970s were also a decade of a commodity boom. And Prebisch, who was alive then, was very worried. And he was right. When the boom ended, Latin America entered into the worst decade, the so-called lost decade of the 1980s, since the Great Depression.
And perhaps Argentina is the worst case. Argentina used to be among the richest countries in the world, and nowadays is passing through a lot of difficulties.
Yes, Argentina, at the time that Prebisch was growing up, was probably the second wealthiest country in the world, and at a par with Australia or Canada in that group of countries. And it certainly has fallen way back in this regard. But of course, Prebisch, who put so much of his life into Argentina as head of the central bank, and then was forced to leave, it was for him one of the great disappointments of his life that Argentina didn't take the same path as, say, Australia.
Yeah, he studied Australia and New Zealand, and he was amazed amazed how the system worked there and didn't work in Argentina.
Yeah.
Could you explain us this difference that Prebisch found at that time?
Well, Prebisch went to Australia and New Zealand and found two things that made the contrast with Argentina so evident. The first was that Australia, unlike Argentina, had a strong state. It was a state that collected taxes. There was an income tax. It had good statistics. It was a strong but lean state. And Prebisch called that an intelligent state. So this was one thing. Argentina, at that time, had one of the great cities of the world, but it had a flabby...
It was great at that time.
Yeah, but it had a flabby state. It was not capable of introducing an income tax. That's one thing. But secondly, Australia had an agricultural system that worked. And the reason was a land reform in which land settlement was completely different than in Argentina.
One of the focus of Prebisch was industrialization.
Yes.
By that time.
Yeah.
But things have changed a lot. We are nowadays in a third wave of industrialization, dealing with internet and other kind of technology. This Prebisch worry, still has importance, or we don't have to worry about that point?
Well, I think it's a worrisome issue, and my own country, Canada, is experiencing the same issues of overvalued exchange rates, Dutch disease, as they say, deindustrialization, and so forth. It's true.
Familiar in Brazil.
Yes. In Brasilia, where I was recently there last week, even cab drivers, taxi drivers, asked me about the Dutch disease.
Yes, it's popular.
It's made its way all the way down. The problem is to do something about it. Australia is the same, going through the same thing. Now the question is where this is going to lead. And the reason that Prebisch would be concerned in all cases is that the quality of exports is different. To have industrial exports improves the chance for backward and forward supply chains. Prebisch's views were actually adopted in East Asia. And the country which most clearly approximates Prebisch's views would be South Korea. Strong education.
Very successful.
Yeah, very strong education, concern for equality, therefore a large domestic market, concern for research and development, and concern to build competitive industries for the local market as well as for export.
And there's why Prebisch was quite a character. He was hated and loved. Why he was so hated and loved?
Well, he was mainly hated in Argentina and mainly loved outside of Argentina. The person who he felt closest to was Celso Furtado, a great friendship. And he very much admired Kubitschek.
Yes.
And others. Even Vargas, President Vargas, who he met in 1940, did many friends in Brazil.
Because of industrialization, that Vargas and Kubitschek brought the industries to Brazil.
Yes, he felt that Brazil was serious about development, and that Brazil was constructing things like the BNDES that were permanently valuable and that would really help Brazil through the difficult phases of development. And development is very difficult, and it needs these tools like a national development bank. No, he was loved abroad for being vital, for contradicting the United States when necessary, for building the belief in countries that they could develop. He was a great animator and a terrific speaker of charisma. He was a wonderful person. But in Argentina, the situation is entirely different.
Nós voltamos agora com a entrevista de Edgard Dosman sobre a biografia de Raúl Prebisch, o economista argentino, que teve uma tremenda briga com Perón. Nós vamos saber como foi essa briga. Professor Dosman, Prebisch had a big dispute with Perón.
Yeah.
And nowadays, as you said in your book, there's no statue to Prebisch on Argentina, but Perón is still loved. Who is wrong, the Argentinians or Prebisch?
Well, poor Prebisch. He had very bad luck with Argentina, and so much of it seems odd. Prebisch, first of all, was not from the wealthy class. He was from the provincial town of Tucumán, and he was from a middle-class family that didn't even own its own home. But what he did see when he grew up was the sugar plantations and the exploitation of Indian labor from Bolivia. When he came to Buenos Aires, he was determined to change that through the public service, and eventually became head of the central bank. The problem for Perón was that in 1930 there was a revolution in Argentina as well as in Brazil.
Yes.
But the revolution in Argentina gave way to what was called the infamous decade, which
different from Brazil that
That's right.
began the industrialization.
That's right. So this period, the infamous decade, or the Década Infame, became associated with Prebisch because he was head of the central bank.
And he was very young that time.
He was very young. He was a brilliant guy, and he was also a great administrator. He could do many things. But because of that association, he was called very unjustly as a supporter of the old regime, of the oligarchy. And he was never able to escape that, never. So in 1943, it was a Perón-led attack on Prebisch, and he was sacked, fired from the central bank.
Mm-hmm.
In 1955, the so-called liberation revolution kicked out Perón, and the general of the day asked Prebisch to come back to help reconstruct the economy. Perón had been a disaster for the economy, and Prebisch very foolishly went back. In 1 year, he became the most hated man in Argentina.
And at that time, Argentina was a wealthy country,
Yes.
and he proposed very tough measures to fiscal, monetary measures, and he was hated by the people, right?
That's right. He managed to be hated by every group, the right and the left. And you ask yourself, is that the problem of Prebisch, or is it the problem of Argentina? But the fact is that he was a modernizing, powerful figure who very much disliked what Perón had done for the economy and, frankly, for the political system. So this dislike of Prebisch continues on because Peronism has kept going. And so when he returned to Argentina in 1984, after the military was gone, he was still incapable of getting anything done. There was still the dislike of this man. And for the rest of Latin America, he was seen as a liberator, as even a leftist, someone who promoted industrialization, somebody who was concerned for justice. So these were images that were completely different.
It's the danger of to propose a third way to be hated in the left and by the right. Yes. He was a kind of pioneer of the third way.
Well, he was the third way.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the third way. He was never a Marxist, and he wasn't an orthodox economist. No, he was in the middle, always in the middle. And when you have an extreme century, like the 20th century, you get it from both sides. He was wonderfully controversial, and for a writer, you can't do better.
Yes, and even with Furtado, who used to be a close friend, he had a horrible dispute. Could you explain us how it happened?
Yes, this was in 1957 when Celso Furtado had concluded a study of the Mexican economy, which the Mexican government disliked, and Prebisch refused to publish it. It was a symbolic issue. Prebisch saw Furtado, rightly, as his intellectual equal. They were the two giants of 20th century Latin American economic history. And for Furtado to be rejected, to have that report rejected, was both a shock and a terrible insult. But for Prebisch, who ran that organization and who depended on governments, he was caught again in the middle and reluctantly, I think, turned down Furtado's request to publish this report. And yet, there is another side to it. Prebisch came back from Argentina in this catastrophic year, 1955-56, really defeated. And when Prebisch was hurt personally, he became more conservative. So Furtado, who was known to be on the left of CEPAL, Prebisch, it seems now, Prebisch wanted to make sure that CEPAL had a good relationship with governments.
He had to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said in your book that Prebisch was a kind of, he built this conception of Latin America and the third world. Can you explain how it came to build this kind of thought?
I'll try in a short time. CEPAL was in Santiago during the time of McCarthy in the United States. Very difficult time. Prebisch protected his group. But what Prebisch wanted to do in CEPAL, and succeeded, was to bring young economists from all the countries of Latin America together to overcome all of the historic differences between Brazil and Hispanic America, Argentina and Chile, all of these various disputes, and to create a viable market. Prebisch saw integration of Latin America, starting with Mercosur, as an absolutely critical step towards promoting a development in Latin America.
He would be glad nowadays seeing this increasing trade between Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, and other countries.
Well, in 1940, when he went to Brazil, he signed, with Aranha and Vargas in the background, the first Mercosur. It was an agreement to set up a free trade area. No, he was a modern economist, but he was a developmentalist. He didn't just want trade, he wanted development as well as trade. So in Latin America, his vision was bringing together the Latin American countries behind a common commitment to development and to social justice. Then, in 1964, he extended this vision In Geneva, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to the global economy. That's sort of the reason.
Yeah, but this, his role trying to build UNCTAD, I think it was something in your book that we see, but something exhausting. Yeah. Because we have to deal with so many issues, so many interests, so many countries, and kind of it was a task bigger than his.
Well, I call that process spreading the gospel. And yes, it was exhausting. It was probably beyond the strength and powers of even somebody like Raúl Prebisch. And he resigned 4 years later from the job. He had in mind the idea of UNCTAD as more than a talking shop. It's more than debating and studies and academics and all that stuff. He had in mind an UNCTAD with teeth that would negotiate, that would really do something about trade and development. Development was his objective. And you probably know his famous phrase, that is, I am objective, but never neutral.
All right, let's end with this. Thank you very much, Professor Dosman. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Agradecemos também a vocês, assinantes, que acompanharam essa entrevista e convidamos para o próximo Conta Corrente Especial. Até lá!